On the morning of April 26, 1943, the convoy halted without explanation 6 kilometers west of Tunis, and it was in that long stretch of silence, broken only by the metallic ticking of cooling engines and the rhythmic snap of pennants in the dry wind, that Corporal Reinhard Feldberg of the 5th Panzer Regiment first heard the name that would haunt him for the rest of the campaign. Someone in the rear truck had muttered it, half-whispered, like a curse or a prayer, and the words spread from mouth to mouth with the urgency of a contagion. Schmetterlinge. Butterflies. He had no idea then what it meant, only that the faces around him hardened when they heard it, and the older men, veterans of Poland and France, exchanged glances that spoke of something outside the ordinary calculus of war. The convoy resumed its movement an hour later, threading its way through groves of stunted olive trees and hillsides scarred by artillery, and by the time they reached the outskirts of the town, the sun was high and merciless, beating down on the steel of their helmets and turning the air into a shimmering, wavering curtain of heat. They dismounted near the edge of what had been a municipal park, though there was little left to suggest its former purpose, only scorched earth and the skeletal remains of what might once have been a fountain, and it was there, in that trampled and desolate space, that Feldberg saw his first butterfly bomb. It lay half buried in the dirt near the base of a ruined wall, no larger than a beer bottle, painted a dull greenish grey that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the light, and from its midsection protruded a thin metal vein, canted at an odd angle like the wing of some broken insect. He had taken 2 steps toward it when the man beside him, a lance corporal named Konrad Eisner, grabbed his arm with a force that bordered on violence and pulled him back so hard that Feldberg stumbled and nearly fell. Eisner's face was pale beneath the dust and sweat, his eyes wide and bright with something that might have been fear or fury or both, and he pointed at the device without speaking, his hand trembling slightly, as if the act of indicating its presence was itself a form of danger. The briefing that followed was conducted in the shade of a half-collapsed building, delivered by a harried-looking engineer officer whose uniform was stained with oil and whose voice carried the flat, weary tone of a man who had repeated the same information too many times to too many listeners who would not all survive to heed it. The bombs, he explained, were German, dropped by the British in clusters from low-flying aircraft, and they were designed with a malice so refined, so exquisitely attuned to the psychology of soldiers, that they seemed less like weapons than like instruments of deliberate madness. Each one weighed less than 2 kilograms, he said, and they fell spinning, their vanes causing them to flutter and drift erratically as they descended, scattering across roads, fields, rubble heaps, anywhere a man might walk or rest or take cover, and they were fitted with multiple fusing mechanisms, some that detonated on impact, others that armed themselves only after landing and would explode at the slightest vibration, the gentlest touch, even the change in pressure caused by a boot falling nearby or a shadow passing overhead. The officer's hands moved constantly as he spoke, tracing invisible shapes in the air, and Feldberg found himself mesmerized by the gestures, the way they seemed to conjure the image of the bombs tumbling down through the sky like some grotesque parody of nature, their metal wings glinting in the sun, their casings packed with high explosive and fragments of steel that would tear through flesh and bone with an efficiency that was almost surgical. But it was not the lethality that terrified him, not the knowledge that they could shred a man's legs or gut him where he stood, because that was merely death, and death was a constant companion in war, something he had learned to accommodate, if not accept. What terrified him was the uncertainty, the way the bombs transformed every surface into a potential betrayal, every step into an act of faith or folly. The engineer officer told them that some of the bombs were fitted with delayed action fuses, timed to explode hours or even days after they landed, and that others were designed to detonate if moved, lifted, or disturbed in any way, and still others were sensitive to vibration or pressure or even changes in temperature, so that a bomb lying dormant in the cool of the morning might explode in the heat of the afternoon, triggered by the expansion of metal in its fuse mechanism. He told them that the British had scattered thousands of them, perhaps tens of thousands, across the countryside and through the ruins of contested towns, and that there was no reliable way to identify which fusing mechanism a given bomb possessed without examining it closely, and that examining it closely was, of course, the most certain way to die. He told them that the bombs were coloured to blend with their surroundings, painted green for foliage, grey for rubble, yellow for sand, and that they often came to rest in positions that made them almost invisible, nestled in the crook of a broken beam, half covered by dirt or debris, lying in the shadow of a doorway or beneath the burnt-out hulk of a vehicle. He told them that walking through an area that had been bombed meant accepting the possibility that any step might be your last, and that there was no protocol, no procedure, no amount of caution that could guarantee safety, because the bombs were not simply dangerous, they were perversely, diabolically unpredictable, engineered not just to kill, but to instill a paralysis of fear that was almost as effective as the explosions themselves. When the briefing ended, the men dispersed in silence, and Feldberg saw that same silence spread through the entire company over the following days, a kind of collective withdrawal into wariness that changed the way they moved, the way they occupied space. Soldiers who had once walked with the casual confidence of veteran troops now stepped carefully, deliberately, their eyes scanning the ground ahead with the intensity of men picking their way through a minefield, because that was precisely what they were doing, except that minefields could be mapped, marked, cleared with patient effort and established technique, whereas the butterfly bombs defied all such rationality. They were chaos incarnate, scattered without pattern, armed according to no discernible logic, waiting in their thousands for the random collision of circumstance that would trigger their release. Feldberg watched men freeze mid-stride at the sight of a glint of metal in the rubble, watched them detour around patches of ground that looked no different from any other, watched them hesitate before entering buildings or taking cover in depressions that might have seemed like refuge, but could just as easily be a tomb. The fear was contagious, spreading from man to man like a fever, and it was made worse by the stories that circulated through the ranks, stories of men who had been blown apart while trying to move a bomb to safety, stories of entire squads wiped out when a single device detonated and set off a chain reaction among the others lying nearby, stories of men who had seen a bomb and walked away only to have it explode minutes later, killing the soldiers who had replaced them in that exact spot. The stories were never quite verifiable, always second-hand or third-hand, but they carried the weight of truth because everyone had seen the evidence, the fresh craters, the blood-stained fragments, the way entire sections of road or field would be cordoned off with hasty warnings scrawled on scraps of wood or metal, and the bodies, always the bodies, sometimes intact enough to identify, sometimes not, sometimes just a scattering of torn fabric and shattered bone that might once have been a man, but was now only an object lesson in the futility of caution. What made it worse, what made it unbearable, was the knowledge that the bombs were German in origin, manufactured in the Reich's own factories, designed by German engineers, and that they had been captured or copied by the British and turned against their makers with a savage irony that felt almost personal. There was something deeply humiliating about being killed by your own technology, by the very ingenuity that was supposed to guarantee victory, and Feldberg could see that humiliation written on the faces of the men around him, could hear it in the bitter jokes they made, could feel it in the way morale corroded day by day, not with the sudden shock of a catastrophic defeat, but with the slow, grinding erosion of endless, low-grade terror. Officers tried to maintain discipline, tried to insist that the bombs were just another hazard to be managed, just another element of the tactical environment, but their words rang hollow, because they too walked with that same careful, tentative gait, and because orders began to change in response to the threat, missions postponed or rerouted, positions abandoned, not because of enemy action, but because the ground itself had become untenable, saturated with hidden death. Engineers were brought in to clear the bombs, but there were never enough of them, and their work was slow and dangerous and often ineffective, because for every bomb they identified and destroyed, a dozen more lay hidden, and because the fuses were so varied and so sensitive that even the experts made mistakes, and when they made mistakes they died, blown to pieces in front of the men they were supposed to protect, their deaths serving only to reinforce the sense that the bombs were invincible, that there was no defense, no countermeasure, no way to fight back against an enemy that did not reveal itself until the instant of annihilation. By the end of the first week, the regiment had lost more men to the butterfly bombs than to enemy fire, and the psychological toll was incalculable. Soldiers who had fought without flinching in open combat became hesitant, paralyzed by a fear that had no face, no front line, no clear beginning or end, and that paralysis spread beyond the immediate tactical situation, affecting everything from supply runs to reconnaissance patrols to the simple act of setting up a defensive position. The bombs were everywhere and nowhere, a threat that could not be quantified or contained, and the awareness of their presence seeped into every decision, every movement, until the war ceased to be a contest between armies and became instead a solitary struggle between each individual soldier and the randomness of his own survival. Feldberg survived the campaign, though not without scars, and in the years that followed he would sometimes wake in the night with the image of that first bomb vivid in his mind, the dull grey casing, the thin metal vein, the stillness of it lying there in the dust like a thing asleep, waiting. He learned later that the bombs had been declared illegal, banned by international agreement almost as soon as their use became widespread, condemned as indiscriminate, inhumane, a violation of the already tenuous codes that governed the conduct of war. But by then it did not matter, because the damage had been done, not just to bodies, but to something deeper, some fundamental sense of order and predictability that soldiers needed to function, and that the butterfly bombs had shattered as thoroughly as they shattered flesh. He never forgot the way they had changed the men around him, the way they had turned confident warriors into nervous, hunted creatures, glancing over their shoulders, flinching at shadows, afraid not of the enemy they could see, but of the invisible menace that lay coiled beneath every footstep. And he knew that if there was any justice in the universe, the men who had designed those bombs, whoever they were, whatever flag they served, would one day walk through a field seeded with their own creations and feel that same helpless, choking terror, that same awful knowledge that the ground itself had become an enemy, and that there was nowhere left to stand that was not haunted by the prospect of sudden, meaningless